Thank you, Rick. Dwight Tay's communion thoughts this morning resonated with me. He used that word cleansing in that scripture that he read. Cleansing, ongoing. This is a physiological comparison. Our kidneys' job is to continue to cleanse our blood. That's an ongoing process. I guess it's profane to make those two comparisons, but it's something we understand. I worked in Washington, D.C. for about 7 years on DuPont Circle, and part of the compensation package that I had, we vice presidents had, was we had a place to park under the building, and on the very ground floor was a dialysis clinic. Every day when I drove in there, I could get the fragrance of the chemicals they used and the people coming in and going out. I had a brother-in-law, you don't see use of past tense, who wound up getting liver cancer because of a chemical job he had that he was mixing chemicals for some cleaning processes. So he had a transplant. And the chemicals they gave him for the transplant, they told him would destroy his kidneys. And he said, "You'll have to have a transplant." And they did. So he wound up with 3, 2 of which weren't working. They didn't take him out. Finally, he had to have another one. And in 2017, he just gave up. He just said, I can't do this anymore. It's not worth it. The blood of Christ cleanses us every day for the sins that we keep doing. Now, we all knew that. But that, along with Ryan's lesson today, flows right in to our lesson on Judges. And one other personal preamble before I go on. Every time I stand, I talk about how great this congregation is. Frida and I have been married 62 years, and over the course of, I counted up, she'll have to correct my numbers, but over the course of our marriage, places we've been, things we've done, we have been members at 15 different congregations. I've had my chorus on 4 continents, and I guess they've sung at over 1,000 congregations. Never in our lives have we appreciated, enjoyed, or felt more welcome or part of the fabric of the congregation than here. The story I'm about to tell is attributed to Abraham Lincoln and to Henry Ford, so if you got somebody better, sign that up. A fellow moved into a new town and said to a denizen who'd been there a long time, said, what's our town like? Old denizen said, what was the town like where you came from? He told him about it. He said, well, I suspect that's what you'll find here. The point is, I urge us to make an extra effort to reach out to become part of what's going on here. We have our connect groups. We have prayer groups. There's so many different activities going on, but let me tell you just one story. So we've been here 6 years. I've watched Jeremy Turner lead singing on Sunday nights lots of times. We'd speak, talk, that'd be it. We're having singing coming up next week. And I said, would you lead a song for us? Sure. So he sits back here in the back one Sunday night. He says, I'm going to have to leave. He's wearing a shirt that says FedEx on it. So I said to Wyatt Rampy, does Jeremy work at FedEx? He said, I don't think so. So we're talking this morning, and I said, how'd you come to do what you're doing? And well, he is the managing CEO of a company that provides uniforms. So this little interaction moved from, hey, how you doing, to somebody with whom I have a connection. My point is, take advantage of every opportunity that comes along to meet somebody and get past the weather and how are you doing. This church is so welcoming, and there are so many opportunities to participate. I am 82 years old, and I am so thankful for the opportunity to try to teach. And as I was preparing this lesson this week, just absolutely overwhelmed with all the information that comes in, and I become the focal lens as to what to talk and what to try to bring to you, and the burden just gets greater and greater and greater. What if I miss it? What if I tell something that's wrong? Plus, there's an extra burden this morning because I'm going to talk about concubines. We don't talk about that in public discourse. So, all the preamble out of the way, let's see if I can keep things going. Tola and Jair were two of our judges. Jephthah is the main focal point today, and then the last three in our chapters are Isban, Elon, and Abdon. So these are the judges. Some of these slides you will have seen before, and if it turns out that I've run out of material, I have put some of the other slides we had just as a review to cover. So these are the judges that we have, and we're getting down close to Samson, and then we'll have Ruth and others. So this is a color slide here. Now you'll remember in the morning, we could just sit down and go home here and go have coffee or something, because Ryan covered everything that we're going to talk about today. But God said, I am a jealous God and don't have any other gods before me. And his point also was made, if you do, the things are going to go bad for you. So I like this map here because it's colorful. And if you look, whoops, this happens every time. Go through half of my presentation. All right, push the green button. Right here is where this takes place today in Gilead. It's over on the eastern side of Jordan. Ephraim gets involved with them, Gad just a little bit, and then you've got the tribe of Benjamin down here. The Ephraimites get all bent out of shape because they say that Jephthah didn't invite them to help fight, and they're so upset about it, so we're going to burn your house down with you in it. That's kind of the way they opened up. So what we have is, this is the promised land. These are the tribes where they were to occupy it. God said, go take it all, and they didn't do that. After Joshua's death, there weren't any leaders, and so we wound up with these judges. And I thought growing up when we were talking about judges that these judges are all over Israel. These guys were regional people, and we've been talking about that, which is why I'm saying today we're going to be talking about Gilead over here, and they talk about crossing over the east and west side of Jordan. So then the Israelites began to make relationships with inhabitants and even marry them. Marriages resulted in turning away from God, and then I'm supposed to read this material that I have right here. That little note in the bottom keeps me from getting mixed up. So by breaking seemingly innocuous command to make no covenant with the inhabitants of the land, Judges 2 and Exodus 23, Israel began its downfall. Israel was to be God's arm of justice, and the Canaanite people's wickedness was full and overflowing. Fraternization and intermarriage with idolaters led to idolatry. The chain reaction of unbelief continued as Israel abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, and went after other gods. Among the gods of peoples who were found around them, Baal and Ashtaroth. Now, this is the male and female god, and there was all kinds of terrible sacrifices in that. You will recall that some gave their children even to burn them in Molech. Child sacrifice wasn't a problem. And so that works into our discussion of Jephthah and his vow today. So they followed the gods of Syria, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the Amorites, and the Philistines. Baalism proved to be attractive to Israel, particularly at this point in its history. So God delivered them from Egypt, as Ryan talked about this morning, and they went through their nomadic period, and when they came here, they wound up getting a sedentary, and things changed for them. So they serve the Baals, and these are those gods that we just looked at here, and then this is the same map, just a little bit larger. So the judges we studied today are Tola. He was born and lived in Shamir. He was from Israel, Ephraim, and he served 23 years, and he was buried in Shamir. Jair was 22 years, had 30 sons, 30 donkeys, and 30 cities. What does that mean? Well, that means that this comes into pluralism with regard to women, wives, and concubines and slaves here. He had 30 sons, 30 donkeys. This means he amassed to himself all kinds of riches. And to have 30 sons, you'll recall that Gideon had 70 sons. That means there were multiple women involved in that, because you only produce one a year. So if you're going to shortchange the calendar, you have to add extras in. So this, which I never understood until we began to study this means he was the beneficiary of wealth and riches by virtue of his role as a judge. Jephthah was 6 years, one daughter. He was from Gilead, and then Ibzan, same thing, 30 sons, 30 daughters, and they intermarried. As a matter of fact, they pointed out that was the case. Then Elon was 10 years, and he was in the land of Zebulun. Abdon, Hallel, and these are places where he worked in Ephraim. So intermarriage with the denizens of Canaan, Deuteronomy 7 through, God warned the Hebrews not to intermarry with the people of Canaan at all, because they worshiped false gods, which often included human sacrifice and sexual religious practice, which what we talked about just a little earlier. So Smith's Bible, this is where it gets rocky, guys. I'm as nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs right now, because we don't talk about this in public. So who were concubines in the Bible, and what does it mean? Well, in Smith's Bible Dictionary, there are several things that are listed here. A Hebrew girl sold by her father, a Gentile captive taken in war, a purchased foreign slave, a Canaanite woman, bonded or free. The rights of the first two were protected by the law, but the third was unrecognized and the fourth prohibited. Free Hebrew women might also become concubines. So, a free Hebrew woman who sold herself in situations of dire poverty, keep in mind, we didn't have Social Security, and women were considered to be property, just chattel. You think about this. We'll talk about that in a minute. In situations of dire poverty, women had very few options. A woman could avoid prostitution and homelessness by choosing to sell herself to one man as his concubine. God's plan with Adam and Eve was one man, one woman. And yet, throughout all of those old periods of time, women were just viewed as chattel, an object for the satisfaction of man. Solomon, king, rich, God asked him he asked God for wisdom, 700 wives, 300 concubines. The text that I read and the commentary that goes with it said it was a political power play as part of other things, not only for the sexual satisfaction of the king, but the more handsome the young men were who were in the court, and the more beautiful the women were who were in the harem, the more power for the visiting kings. So Solomon has 700 and 300. How's that going to work? And these people are simply enslaved until it comes their turn. I just can't imagine that. I could remember reading this 1,000 people when I was a kid. I didn't get it. I didn't understand. A Hebrew girl sold by her father. Although rare practice, it was considered to be a parental right to sell one's child as a slave. According to the law, a Hebrew slave would be set free after 6 years of service unless they decided to stay in the household. I cannot imagine selling one of our 3 precious daughters to be the object of sexual pleasure for somebody. That's what happened. Do we get that? So Jesus comes along and he talks about treating women with respect. He's cutting cross grain with all the way the social situation worked. But a man who purchased a Hebrew girl as a concubine must commit to provide for her for life, sell her to another man, or provide for her as his concubine, or return the girl to her father without demanding payment. This is what the dowry idea is. A woman to be married came with a dowry as if she weren't worth it herself. That's what the dowry idea was. So that's the point of this bottom line here is without demanding payment for her. How would we manage living in a set of conditions like this? How did God allow it to happen? Can't answer that. These provisions offered a considerable protection for the slave concubine who might otherwise been liable to grievous wrong and oppression. So there's the tragic story, I'll just mention it briefly, you can look at the text, of this man who had, this is Old Testament, he and his wife had divorced, they had reconciled, and were moving from her home back to where they were to live, and the trip was too long to make in a day, and so they spent the night in an inn. This was a Sodom and Gomorrah type town where the men come along and want to have sexual relationships with the man. They bang on the door and beat on it, and it just wasn't stopping. So finally he says, here, you can take my wife. And so they abuse her all night long. The next morning they let her go, and she finally manages to get back to the door of the hotel, and she dies there. Let that sink in. Old Testament scripture describes it. Hagar was Sarah's handmaid. We know this story. So angels come along, or God's representatives come along with the oath of memory, and they have a conversation. Abraham says, I got to kill a goat for you, and Sarah fix him a meal. Well, this is not something you just go and open the refrigerator and take it out of the freezer and put it in the microwave. This is an all-day process. And they talk, and one of them says, this time next year, there'll be a child. a child will come. He doesn't say when. And so Sarah, when it doesn't happen when she thinks it ought, doesn't trust God to get the job done. And so she gives Hagar to her husband Abraham to have a child. Okay, so you've got these people, although Hagar is her handmaid and a slave, you've got all these people living in the same room where we have Abraham having sexual relationships with both of them. All right, now I've told you this story before, but I recall in Texas, I think it was Dallas, there was this dentist, very wealthy man, who was having an affair with his assistant, and his wife found out about it, and she did a little research and found out where he was going and when he'd have his tryst. And so he goes to a hotel, and she comes up there and waits till he comes out, goes to the parking lot. She drives over him 6 times with her Mercedes. You think she wasn't been out of shape over being betrayed? I'd guess. All right, you have that kind of stress here, and yet it's probably sub rosa. Hagar was hurt by this decision, and so was Sarah. So Solomon's 300 concubines. Not much is known about these stories, but one can imagine the relational neglect and emotional turmoil of sharing a husband with 299 people. And so this marital model is a far cry from what God had in mind. Okay, most scholars believe the period that took place between 1450 and 1000 BC. Dates are still being debated. Leading up to the Judges were 11, where the Ammonites oppressed Israel for 18 years. So the characters are the Ammonites. They crushed and oppressed the people of Israel. Jephthah, mighty warrior, and Jephthah's daughter. So, where did this take place? Gilead, as I mentioned earlier, east side of the Jordan River, lands of Edom, Moab, and Ammon, and then these were on the east side of the Jordan. So Jephthah is called to lead Israel. Jephthah is a man of Gilead, mighty warrior, but he'd been kicked out of his homeland because he was the son of a prostitute. He lived in the land of Tob and made friends with, text says, some worthless fellows. When the Ammonites made war with Israel, 10:17, the men of Gilead came to him. See, they'd already kicked him out, said, you can't fit in our process. Already kicked him out, and so they come and say, we need you to lead our army. And he said, well, remember you kicked me out. And so they promised him that they'd follow him, and he'd be basically the king. So he says, okay. So then they handled this with diplomatic back and forth. So you have situation going on with Iran and Israel and the United States now. And so the United States is saying to these people, got to work all this out, got to solve this. And so we've got messengers going back and forth, people flying from the United States over to try to put pressure on Netanyahu and the Israelites. So they send messages back and forth. And Jephthah dispatched messengers to talk to the king and Ammonites and said, what's your intent? King said, well, basically you guys came through here when you were coming back from Egypt, and you just rolled over us and we're taking our land back now. And Jephthah says, well, you will recall that when we came, we asked you if we couldn't come through your country, and you said no. And so this is we took it and it's ours. So the Israelites went around the land of Edom and Moab, so they didn't go through there. Israelites did conquer their lands and their belongings. So messengers, king says, I'm still going to fight. So Jephthah goes, he wins, and then after that, he makes this vow that gets him in trouble. Now, what did he do? He's afraid when the battle is coming along, and he says, God, if you'll get me through this, I will sacrifice to you whatever comes out to meet me when I get home. Now, there's some discussion in the commentaries that I read, said, well, maybe he expected an animal or something like that to come out. And then there's all the discussion about, well, did Jephthah really do that? Because the text says after she had the time to mourn her virginity for 2 months, he did with her as he'd promised. But remember, other teachers in this auditorium have talked about sacrificing children to Molech. And now Molech was a false god that was a big, tall, steel idol, and it had a basket like this in it. And they would heat that hot to red hot, and they'd toss their babies in there alive to sacrifice them to this god, like Ryan said today, isn't going to do anything for you. So the summary of Jephthah is that he served both as a judge in Israel for 6 years, according to the book of Judges. Judges states that he ruled over Israel for 6 years. His influence was limited to Gilead and to nearby regions. But Jephthah's burial, which he buried in the city of Gilead after he died, and his story is told by the Judges 11 and 12, that makes God, he made a rash vow to God, and God grants Jephthah's request. Jephthah chooses to keep his vow, even though it is difficult and heartbreaking. So he comes home and tells his daughter what he's done, and rather than object, she agrees to that. She said, just let me have 2 months to go out into the mountains and spend time with my friends and mourn the fact that I'm not going to marry and I'm not going to bear children. You see, one of the reasons they needed so many children in those days was because they needed help on the farm. They needed help to do this, and the only way you could do that was produce them. And so that required extra sexual partners to get the job done. So the text also says after this that for several years, every year on the anniversary of this taking place, the women of the region went about mourning for her for 4 days. So that convinces me that Jephthah did what he said he was going to do, because there were all kinds of commentaries that just said we just simply can't believe that. I did a recording a number of years ago for a prominent choral group in Washington, D.C., and the volunteer, this is all volunteer singers, and the person who was leading this and organizing this program had included in the tune list the Old Rugged Cross. So we got there, 180 voices in the chorus, and we got there, and we get down to this song, and why they didn't handle this privately, I don't know, but the choral director says to the guy who's organizing this, he said, we're not going to include that song. Well, why not? I just can't handle this blood business. We just can't do that. We're not. He simply refused to believe Christ died on the cross. And there are a lot of people who refuse to believe that. So my point is, I believe it took place. I mean, there's quite a bit of commentary that trying to decide, well, maybe he didn't take her life after all. Maybe she just spent her life as a virgin, never married. No, it says he did with her as he promised. So the long-term impact, and this is several slides here with several scriptures. You'll recall a couple of weeks ago I said that the Bible Project people say these judges are not good role models. So we have Gideon, who winds up producing 70 sons, and then one brother kills all the rest of them on one stone. That term, one stone, I did a lot of research about that because I couldn't figure out what it meant. The consensus is that means it was sort of like a public hanging. Just brought everybody in and took care of that. So when you get over to the 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews, which Nelson and I took us through not long ago, whose names do you see in that hall of fame of faith? So he's listed all these other people, and he gets down to the summary. The writer gets down to the summary, and he said, "What more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah." So his frailties, his sins, his corruption, all the things that he did wrong, he still was an agent of God. Which brings me back to David of the Old Testament is my favorite Bible character. He did every sin in the book. So first of all, the text says he comes along, and it's spring, and it's time when kings go out to war, and he sends Joab out with his army, and he stays back at the palace, and he sees this beautiful woman bathing. He uses his intelligence community to find out about her and sends for her. We don't know anything about what her behavior was, but if we look at how women have been treated all in during this time, she didn't have an option. I mean, maybe she was pleased to be considered, but she seemed to be a faithful wife. But point is, David took her, another man's wife. She's expecting a baby from this union. Well, I'm going to cover this up. So he sends for Uriah to come home from the battlefront, tells him, go home. I cannot go home and enjoy the pleasures of my wife while my fellows are out there living in tents and fighting and dying. Problem, David. So he gets him drunk, sends him home. What does he do? He goes and sleeps on his front doorstep. Well, things just keep getting worse. So the next thing you know is he sends back with a notice, sealed notice to Joab that says, next time you get in battle, put this guy up on the front, and then when it comes time to pull back, neglect to tell him. Uriah gets killed. So lust, he takes the woman's wife. She's expecting. He tries to cover it up. He has him murdered. So you got Nathan the prophet. How would you like to be Nathan? God says, got a job for you. Go to the king and tell him about his sin. Now, king's power, lop off your head that quick. Can you imagine yourself being Nathan, that long bony finger pointing out? You're the guy that took the one ewe lamb from the poor guy. But you see, Psalm 51, verses 10, 11, and 12, he pours out his heart. He is contrite. He begs for forgiveness, and God grants it. Dwight's comment, the blood of Christ continues to cleanse me of my daily sins. Let that sink in. Eternity is coming. We've heard Nelson Whitfield tell the story of when his brother was passing. And his brother said, if I could just have a closet in the basement of heaven. I want to be included the rich man and Lazarus, and the Lazarus got the crumbs of the rich man's table, may I too be included. Ryan Pitt stood here not that long ago and talked about eternity and pain. He spent his time in the military in Iraq, and he said, someone gets caught in a fire and they're going to be burned to death. He said it takes 60 seconds of incredible pain before shock shuts down the system. You don't feel it anymore. Burning for eternity. Was that the first bell? Okay. So anyway, the rest of this is just the rest of the scripture. Through faith, women received back their dead. And the point is, all of these people didn't receive that promise, but Christ came, and we have it. So that's my.
Going back to Jephthah.
Okay.
I wonder why he made that vow to God. Because it says that the Spirit of the Lord had already come upon him. So he should have known he had the strength. But then all of a sudden, did he doubt himself? And that's a rhetorical question. I don't expect you to have the answer, but did he doubt himself? Did he just think, okay, I put myself out here. I've got to make sure I don't, what is it? Was it his pride that said, I got to make sure I don't fail? Even though he knew that, and then to make such a commitment, unless he kept goats and chickens in the house, that wasn't going to come out the door first.
Right.
It's just, it's hard to make sense of why he did what he did.
I agree. Scott?
So he's not the only one to demonstrate doubt, right? Gideon asked God twice, right, to reassure him that things were going to go his way. There's some authentic human fear in the book of Judges, and humans do not fear well. We just don't do graceful things when we're afraid.
That's true. And come back to Sarah. I mean, we wound up with Hagar because Sarah decides God ain't going to deliver her like he promised. I mean, just think about us. How we are so weak and so frail, and so our faith is so tested. And I mean, what I didn't mention here was, so the Ammonites they're giving them a bad time, and so they cry out to God, and he says, you guys are on your own. I'm not going to help you anymore. That's it. And they just, like the widow in the New Testament, kept begging, and so that finally God says, okay.
Another thing about Jephthah is that we really got to interpret what he did, even though the scripture doesn't specifically say this was a terrible thing. We got to appreciate that it must have been seen as a terrible thing because, as you pointed out, it's illegal in the law to burn your children, right? Jephthah either didn't know the law well enough to know it, or he did, and instead of putting himself on the chopping block and saying, Lord, you don't want sacrifice children, I have to break my vow, punish me. He went ahead and went through with it.
Yeah. Well, I'm grateful for your attention today. Thank you so much. I hope we can dismiss before the next bell rings. Thank you. Chip, do you want to say something? Oh, okay.
That means you got to quit.
Thank you.